School begins next week, and with that comes a certain kind of pressure. Students and their parents can have very high expectations to excel inside and outside of the classroom. But are these expectations realistic? And perhaps they do more harm than good when they lead to perfectionism. To answer these questions and others, we reached Simon Sherry. He's a clinical psychologist and a professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax, and he's also an expert on perfectionism. Good morning.
Good morning.
How high is too high when it comes to expectations?
I think the real culprit may not be how high expectations are, but the real culprit is when you have expectations that are communicated from parents to kids in a way where there's criticism, controllingness, and demandingness present. Those harsh, critical, and controlling sorts of expectations tend to create damage by generating kids that are perfectionistic and the many psychological difficulties that go along with being a perfectionist.
Before we unpack perfectionism, I'd just like to know if you could give me some examples of things you've seen in your practice about what this looks like.
It looks like a young person who cannot relax until whatever they're working on is perfect. It looks like someone who is extremely reactive to even minor or perceived mistakes. It looks like someone who experiences enormous pressure to be perfect, whether that's pressure that's real or pressure that's imagined. It's someone who's often quite doubtful in what they do, checking and rechecking in the service of trying to do things perfectly. And it often shows up in my office accompanied by disordered eating, depression, anxiety, suicidality, or other such serious concerns.
How common is this? How often do you see it?
I think that perfectionism is very much a problem of our times, and that's reflected in research my colleagues and I have recently published, wherein we see that young people are more perfectionistic today than ever before, and that there has been a meaningful rise in levels of perfectionism over the past 25 years. And
what's driving it? Do we lay it all at the door of parents?
Parenting practices are certainly part of the rise in perfectionism. We've got a generation of parents who need to land their helicopter and park their snowplow and stop being so heavily involved and heavily overprotective of their kids, let their kids learn to experience failure, to have mistakes, and to learn from those opportunities. I think beyond parenting practices, we also have a generation that's grown up immersed in social media, where people are inundated with lofty, unrealistic, perfectionistic images, and those images have now become a yardstick that people use to measure themselves. So it's never been harder to keep up with the Joneses in this social media era, where you're comparing yourself to your neighbor's successes and your neighbor's vacation and your neighbor's accomplishments. It's now a bombardment that occurs 24/7.
And for children in this situation, students, whether they're young in elementary school or they're high school or university age, is it the drive to get an A+?
That's part of it. We're rearing children in an environment where rank and winning and self-interest and performance and status are paramount. And we're placing a lot of emphasis on outcomes like getting that A+, and de-emphasizing things like following a sound process in arriving at that mark, maybe a sound process that would involve emphasizing hard work and discipline and taking a dedicated approach. We're too much focused on the A+ or perfection to the detriment of our kids. And we're teaching them that it's a brutal dog-eat-dog world out there, and you have to be perfect in order to succeed.
Yes, but to a certain extent it is, right? I mean, you parents are only reflecting the idea of or the facts of what it takes to be successful and get ahead in life, aren't they?
Ironically, teaching your child to pursue perfection is not going to allow them to get ahead in life. That perfectionism is going to become an impediment to achievement, and we see this when we study children in achievement settings, with perfectionism being linked to public speaking, anxiety, test-taking anxiety, academic stress, and fear of failure. So the perfectionism that they end up internalizing from these parenting practices ends up backfiring and actually undermining success. There is, however, still a clear role for parents who have high expectations for their children, but you need to take those high expectations and back them with a strongly supportive parenting style, and to not love that child in a way that's critical, controlling, demanding, and hostile, and to not love your child conditional on their last performance. A lot of kids get the idea from parenting practices these days that they're only as good as their last test or their last soccer match or what have you, and that sort of conditional love children internalize, and it becomes harmful for them down the road when they inevitably encounter something less than perfect.
You talk about parenting practices. Can you be more specific about what those practices are? What are parents saying and doing?
Sure. An archetypal story that would turn up in my office is, I bring home a test from school. I got 95. Dad focuses on the missing 5%. So they're very outcome-focused and lofty and unrealistic, and that teaches children that even minor mistakes, like getting a question or two, are somehow to be an area of focus, something to be even catastrophized about, something that you should be upset about if you're somehow less than perfect. And I think a much healthier thing to do would be to teach children the value of hard work, the value of discipline, without placing upon them some sort of requirement that they be perfect. We're living in an era now where parents and our society at large is very intolerant of any sort of mistake, where people react strongly to perceived or actual imperfections, treating them as catastrophes, as opposed to changing your attitude and just reframing these mistakes as learning opportunities or as a risk that you took, and it was good that you risked failure and tried something new.
Well, there's so much pressure on parents, though, to have their children succeed, to do everything right. There's so much social media pressure around parenting. Everybody can judge you on Facebook, from the moment your child is born until they leave the nest and beyond.
And I think it's important to start to question whether or not we need to be participating in these types of social media practices, and to give children and parents alike tools that help them realize that when it comes to social media, the game is often rigged, that you're dealing with unrepresentative images that have often been photoshopped and airbrushed and otherwise altered, and to allow people to see through these lofty and unrealistic depictions on social media as often false representations of what actually happens.
Right. And what kind of pushback do you get from parents when you have to help them work through this, if they clearly have a child who's in distress and you've got to break the news to them that they have to also change the way they deal with their child?
I think most parents love their children. I think most parents want to do right by their children, and most parents are willing to listen. I think, unfortunately, there's a subset of parents who likely don't show up for therapy seeking help from a psychologist, who are just downright abusive, and they're unlikely to change.
Right. But for those who do, going into the new school year, those who feel that they can change, then they want to. They want to help. They don't want to hurt or hold back their child. Can you give us a set of, help define what would be realistic goals?
There are absolutely things that parents should take into account moving forward here. One would be to try and love your child without placing obvious performance-related conditions upon them. What we see time and time again is that parents enter into their children's lives and they love and care and provide support conditional on how well that child is doing. So if the child doesn't perform well in the hockey rink or in the academic setting, they will sometimes obviously and sometimes subtly start to withdraw care and support and affection. Another thing, and it's sort of curious, but I have observed it not uncommonly in my clinical practice, is sometimes if you have no expectations whatsoever for your child, that can also backfire in that the child will gravitate toward trying to do something perfectly, forgetting that sometimes good enough is just good enough, and that sometimes you don't need to stay up till 1 a.m. doing your grade 6 science project. So it's good to have expectations for your child. The other real thing that I see here as a problem is that parents can enter into a place where they become psychologically controlling. And that psychologically controlling parent is intrusive, and they're overprotective. They're trying to complete their child's sentence, tell them what they should think, what they should feel, what they should do, and in doing so they often suppress what that child actually wants, needs, or desires.
Have you been able to help people in this situation?
Yes, I wouldn't say that perfectionism is especially easy to treat, but I do think it is possible for perfectionistic parents and perfectionistic offspring to change. Oftentimes that takes a committed effort, but over the last 25 years we've greatly improved our scientific understanding of perfectionism, and along with that we're starting to develop treatments that work for perfectionism. There are some barriers to implementing treatment for perfectionism. One is that a lot of perfectionists will be reluctant to seek help because to do so is to admit that they're in some way less than perfect. Another challenge along with that is that perfectionism itself can sometimes sabotage psychotherapy, whereby you have those lofty and unrealistic expectations starting to creep in and to undermine the relationships and the expectations that are formed as part of therapy. But I would say with a capable trained psychologist or other helping professional, it is possible to put a dent in perfectionism.
Thank you so much for joining us today. These are important things to think about as we head into the school year.
Absolutely, and I appreciate having the conversation.
Bye now.
Goodbye.
Simon Sherry is a clinical psychologist and a professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax. He's an expert on perfectionism.